So, I want to talk about the fairies' tithe to hell. And this is something to begin with that I want to be very clear is specific to one area, primarily in Scotland. This is not a really widespread belief. This is not something we find in all fairy lore. You don't find it in other cultures. It really is something that started in the lowlands of Scotland and kind of has primarily been there for a long time. In more recent years, there has been some talk of it in urban fantasy and even in some types of pagan spirituality that acknowledges fairies as if it is a more sort of universal concept. But I think it's important to go into this understanding that the idea of the fairies tied to hell is really, really, really regionally specific. This is something that we find in one particular area. It's not widespread. So, that all said at the beginning, what exactly is the fairies tied to hell? This is something that we see mentioned specifically in a couple ballads. It shows up in Thomas the Rhymer, but not actually in the ballad version. It shows up in the older prose version, Thomas of Ercildoune, which predates the ballad version, did not make it into the ballad version, got dropped, but it is in the older original story version. We also find it in the Ballad of Tam Lin, where it actually is sort of a pivotal and key plot point to the story being told in that ballad. And we see it mentioned in a couple of the witch trials that occurred in the later 1600s, the late 17th century, where specific witches who were on trial in Scotland, again around this same general sort of Selkirk area, talk about the fairies paying a tithe to hell. So this is not something we actually have a lot of information on because it is so regionally specific. We have it in a handful of references basically, but it is something that we do have in this area. And what the fairies tied to hell is, what the concept behind it is that the fairies are beings that are, in this particular belief, not angels. They were not good enough to remain in heaven, but they're also not demons. They were not bad enough to go down to hell, as it were. And there's a couple different versions of the story of how they end up where they are, but the general idea is that they exist in this sort of middle ground. Not bad enough for hell, not good enough for heaven, sort of trapped in between. And specifically in these areas of Scotland, they were thought to be sort of the tenants of the devil. They rented from him, to be more blunt about it. And so the idea of the land of fairy, elfland, the other world, being sort of a sublet of hell, something that belonged officially to the devil, but was rented out to the good folk, to the fairies. And because this was this sort of established ownership system, again, in this particular folk belief, the fairies had to pay rent. And this rent comes in folklore in potentially two different forms. We see one version mentioned, and this was specifically mentioned in one of the witchcraft trials, of a cane to hell. A cane is a specific yearly rental payment that is mentioned in Scottish law. I believe it's spelled C-A-I-N, but I may be misremembering that. And again, dyslexic, so spelling not my forte. But a cane is a specific yearly payment that would be made. And so we do have references to that, again, from this particular witchcraft trial account. And by this theory, they would pay effectively a tenth of their population was their rental payment. Now, the other version that we find, which mentions more directly a tithe or a tithe to hell, in those cases, and again, this is what we find in the ballad version and in the story of Thomas the Rhymer and some other sources, this was paid every 7 years. So as opposed to being yearly, it would be every 7 years that the fairies would have to pay this portion, generally believed to be a tenth, a portion of their population. Now, as with everything else with this subject, there is a lot of variance, even in such a small regional belief. We've already seen some versions say it was once a year, some versions say it was once every 7 years. There's also disagreement on exactly what the tithe was. Usually it is described as sort of a tenth of the population. However, there are accounts where it is one person. So one specific person would have to be paid as the tithe, would have to be given to the devil in order for the fairies to continue to have fairyland or elfland as their territory. And this is sort of where it comes in as a pivotal plot point in a lot of the stories and the ballads that it appears in. Usually one of the main characters is afraid of being the tithe and is trying to avoid that fate. There is a lot of speculation across sort of Scottish material, particularly from that area, that perhaps at least part of the original idea with changelings, where that concept might have come from, could relate to this. It is used as an explanation for why the fairies created changelings, why they took humans in some cases, being that they would take these humans, babies, children, adults, whatever, and leave a changeling in its place. And they would do that so that they could give these humans they had taken as their rental payment, as it were, instead of having to actually pay their own population, having to give up their own people. So that is one explanation we find sort of for why the fairies would steal humans, is to pay this tithe. It's also important to note when we see references to the tithe, it's usually occurring around Samhain, which would be modern day Halloween. In these days, of course, it's October 31st into November 1st. There was a calendar shift in the 19th century, so the older dates for Samhain on our modern calendar would actually be November 11th. And there's some interesting modern connections with that date, which I'll not get into in this video, but important to note that the reason that was picked was not, as some people might assume, because it had some sort of pagan significance or because this was some sort of, pivotal magical time of year. That was actually a time historically when rents were paid in Scotland. They were referred to as cross-quarter days, I believe, in Scotland. I have to admit, and I encourage people to research this themselves. Again, this is where my dyslexia sometimes causes me some issues with this material. In England, they're referred to as quarter days. The main quarter days being May 1st and November 1st would be the primary two. Then you have August 1st and February 1st. So it kind of forms this literal cross, hence cross quarter days, dividing the year into quarters. However, in Ireland and Scotland, I believe it is, they are referred to as cross quarter days instead of quarter days. And I think I just messed that up trying to explain it. Gotta love it. So in one area, we see them referred to as quarter days. They quarter the year. In another area, we see them referred to as cross-quarter days. They're the same days, no matter which one we're looking at. They're just referred to slightly differently. So I realize that's very, very confusing, and I apologize. But my wider point here is that rents would be paid every 3 months. And those dates would generally be May 1st, August 1st, November 1st, and February 1st. Except in the specific areas where they were paid on what we would say were the solstices and equinoxes. The either quarter days or cross quarter days, depending on which calendar we're using. Yes, that all is very confusing. Again, this is one of these regionally specific, it kind of depends on what area you were in things. My point in getting into all of that and causing all this confusion is just to emphasize that the reason it was November 1st, the reason it was our modern day Halloween or Samhain, is specifically because this was a day traditionally in that part of Scotland where rent was paid, where rent was due. So while yes, we do also have these sort of deeper mystical, occult, pagan, otherworldly associations with that date, with that holiday that occurs on that date. And that certainly does sort of come into play a bit, particularly in the ballad material and the stories connected to this. The reason that the fairies' tithe to hell occurs on that date is not for any of those mystical sort of occult reasons. It's literally because that was the day that rent was due for all of the humans who were living in that area as well. So it's kind of this implication that, and this is something that Reverend Kirk mentions in his Secret Commonwealth, that the fairies have this society that is built in some ways on mimicking or imitating human culture that's around them. So humans have to pay rent on that day. The belief in that area is that the good folk also have to pay rent on that day, except they pay rent to the devil, and the rent that they pay is in the form of souls or living beings. Hence, as you mentioned, potentially why they steal humans, so that they can pay with human souls instead of fairies. All of this kind of complicated and mixed together. I am sort of trying to give you the quicker recap version of this belief. We could definitely get into a much longer, more thorough discussion of the fairies' tithe to hell, but these are sort of the highlights and the important parts to be aware of, that this is a regional belief, lowlands of Scotland, that the idea was that the fairies were in some way obligated to the devil, that the territory that they possessed, Elfland, Fairyland, was in fact technically his, sort of a sublet of hell, and that they therefore had to pay him rent every year or every 7 years, depending on the belief, in order to maintain sovereignty or autonomy over that area. And that this rent was paid, again, possibly every year, possibly every 7 years, but that it absolutely had to be paid. And it could be an individual in some belief, and it could be a tenth of the entire population in others. Personally, I tend to favor the single individual theory, because that just seems to make more sense. If they're giving up a tenth of their population, even if it's only every 7 years, that's an awful lot of people every 7 years. And unless they're stealing a lot of humans, since we know that sort of the good folk are not known to reproduce frequently, one would imagine that in a very short amount of time, from their perspective, comparatively speaking, they would just run out of people. Because, they would have to either steal so many, or every year they would be losing and their population would just continually be declining because of this rent paying. So that is a quick recap of what exactly the fairies' tithe to hell is. And I do encourage people, if you're curious about it, Dr. Lyle has a good article in a journal called Folklore, specifically about the fairies' tithe to hell. I have also written about it myself in a magazine called Pagan Dawn. I think I have that article up on Academia EDU, but I'm not positive. If I do, I'll link it in the comments of the video for people who are curious to learn a little bit more. But that's sort of the nuts and bolts that you need to know. And that is important going forward into learning more about ballad material. Also just generally important, I think, to kind of understand the context of some of the fairy beliefs, particularly some of the Scottish fairy beliefs, to kind of have this perspective and understanding of what the tithe was, why it was done, when it was done, possibly, and all of that. So if you have any questions about the fairies' tithe to hell, please put them in the comments. I will add a bit of a disclaimer here based on some of the previous comments. I know not everyone is a fan of Christian belief or Christian cosmology. This particular piece of folklore is clearly framed through that particular system. It's important to keep in mind that folklore, particularly in these areas that we're discussing relating to fairies, is a very syncretic thing. It's very much a blend of different beliefs and practices. And while we do have some material that we might say is, probably older. We do have quite a bit that has clearly been sort of influenced or seen through a Christian lens. Really can't throw all of that out. We wouldn't have very much left if we did. You don't necessarily have to yourself choose to believe this idea that the fairies pay a tithe to hell. As I mentioned anyway, it's very regionally specific. It's not a universal belief to begin with, but it is sort of important to understand that it's a belief that's out there, and what the context for it was, and sort of the influence and effect that it had on some other fairy material, particularly from that area. So, a little bit of food for thought. Again, any questions, put them in the comments, and hopefully this at least clarifies a little bit or gives you a little bit more information on what exactly the tithe to hell is. Have a great day.